Carter entered office championing arms control and challenging the Joint Chiefs to consider a minimum deterrent nuclear force, consisting of fleet ballistic missile submarines.
He had been an officer on a nuclear submarine. One of the first questions he asked during the first presidential briefing on nuclear plans, why don't we just have a survivable force of 200 missiles? I think may have been the beginning of the end of his credibility with the military.
Within his first year in office, the president confronted an increasingly aggressive Soviet adversary. Now, in the face of new and worrisome intelligence estimates, Carter issued Presidential Directive 18 that launched a review of U.S. targeting policy. Leon Sloss, who had a long tenure with the State Department, led a seminal study called the Nuclear Targeting Policy Review.
I think a critical driver was a reassessment of Soviet strategic objectives. And then we also assessed how they were building and deploying their forces. They believed that they could survive a nuclear war, they could control a nuclear war.
What Sloss's study came out and said was, you're dealing with people who look at nuclear war differently. They build deep bunkers, they plan for reloads and refirings of ICBMs. These guys have a different view, and what you need to do if you're going to have an effective deterrent is get into the mind of the Soviet leadership, figure out what they value, and hold it at risk.
Obviously, their own lives were important. Their control over the various constituents of the Soviet Union and their own political control. Therefore, the countervailing strategy concentrated on those targets.
The countervailing strategy. I woke up one morning and said for the posture statement, we needed something a little bit different to help Secretary Brown and get him some publicity. And I said, why don't we call it countervailing instead of counterforce or something? And so I can't even remember whether I discussed it with Harold or whether I just put it in the posture statement. But it went over. Not a thing changed.
PD-59, however, had an important breakthrough. It was an attempt to look at deterrence through Soviet eyes. And that became the basis for the notion of having many options, of having them nested.
I was discouraged to discover that there was a notion that we might attack the Soviet political leadership. And if we did so, all possibilities of restraint would be destroyed at that time.
On the other hand, if leadership on the other side is convinced that, well, things may go badly, but we'll survive in the end, that's not as much of a deterrent as the thought that if things go badly and if we can't reach a settlement before almost everybody before tens of millions of people get killed, you're not going to be able to survive personally.
This is the Harold Brown, we're not going to win a nuclear war. We know that. We need to make sure the Soviet leaders understand the same thing.
In an era of strategic nuclear equivalence, the U.S. sought to deny the Soviets any possibility of victory by remaining capable of fighting successfully. PD-59 signaled a decisive shift away from the policy of mutual assured destruction toward a posture of nuclear war fighting.
But I think it was very clear in Harold Brown's mind that the purpose of this was to influence the Soviet decision maker, not to fight a nuclear war.
I never read PD-59 to say we expected to win. We read PD-59 as saying that we were to terminate hostilities on circumstances favorable to the United States. That's quite different from winning.
In 1975, a snapshot would reveal two superpowers armed to the teeth, with the Soviet Union having more momentum than the U.S.
The nuclear buildup that began in the mid-70s was in response to the perception that the Soviet Union was pulling ahead of the United States. And we saw our comparative advantage being in technology, so we were always pushing our technological imperative.
In an age of sophisticated technology, the computer plays an increasingly large part in DNA's program. Computer-generated codes describe the nuclear blast and thermal environment and predict the effects on weapon systems.
The neutron bomb was something that was actually first developed for the Sentinel system. And this was a warhead which would kill by strong flux of 14 million volt neutrons. But once one realized that the kill was produced by neutrons, people began to think about the possibility of killing people and not equipment or not facilities.
Particularly in relation to the hypothetical use selectively in Western Europe.
Tests were aimed at defining and solving the problems of tactical nuclear warfare. Could troops and vehicles move through the terrain in the wake of a tactical weapons blast?
The problem there was how do you defeat mass tank invasions without destroying all the villages, which are about a mile or so apart throughout Central Europe. If you do it with neutrons, the idea was you can go to much lower yield and leave the villages and their inhabitants unscathed, relatively speaking. None of this would be very clean, and still get at the tank crews.
It's making nuclear weapons seem less threatening if they come to seem more like conventional weapons and actually can be used in theater operations rather than just to destroy cities.
In June 1977, the Carter administration's defense budget included the production of enhanced radiation nuclear warheads. The so-called neutron bomb was to be deployed on NATO bases and was described as the first in a new generation of tactical mini-nukes. By early 1978, Jimmy Carter found himself at the center of a heated debate that played out in the streets of Western Europe and at NATO headquarters. Protesters alleged that the neutron bomb would kill people, leaving property intact. At the same time, NATO defense ministers feared being decoupled from the U.S. strategic deterrent, leaving Europe to become a nuclear battlefield. Under intense public pressure, Carter suspended production and deployment of neutron weapons.
The neutron bomb, in terms of public opinion, was definitely a non-starter, and it contributed to what was a new wave of anti-nuclear activism.
Brussels, December 1979, an unusual joint meeting of NATO defense and foreign ministers.
On December 12, 1979, NATO agreed to modernize its nuclear forces, going forward with plans to deploy new intermediate-range nuclear missiles.
The fear was that the Soviets could strike Western Europe from their homeland, and we had no comparable system. And so NATO embarked on the so-called two-track strategy. It would modernize to have a comparable capability by deploying ground-launched cruise missiles in 5 countries and by deploying a modified Pershing II missile in Germany. And it would seek to eliminate the SS-20s through negotiations.
But no sooner had the two-track decision been made, the Soviets then invaded Afghanistan.
It began on Christmas Eve with 350 transport planes shuttling a Soviet airborne division into Kabul airport. 3 days later, the main invasion force followed. 50,000 troops crossed the Soviet-Afghan border. The Kremlin had committed its forces to a long and costly occupation.
Neither the United States nor any other nation which is committed to world peace and stability can continue to do business as usual with the Soviet Union.
The invasion led to a suspension of talks with the Soviets on intermediate-range nuclear forces in Europe, and it forced Jimmy Carter to withdraw SALT II from consideration by the U.S. Senate. The treaty had been the centerpiece of Carter's efforts to reinvigorate détente. Its withdrawal dealt a sharp blow to the president. Carter was left with the largest peacetime military buildup in history, which he had initiated with the 1980 defense budget. For many Americans, the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan marked the end of détente and the beginning of a second Cold War, with a new and more virulent nuclear arms race.
The proposal by Forsberg of a nuclear freeze it in place, had the wonderful appeal of simplicity. It was easy to grasp.
It was such a moderate appeal for a radical campaign, and it was contrasted with this radical rhetoric of the president.
How do you do? Sam?
Mr. President, what do you see as the long-range intentions of the Soviet Union?
I don't have to think of an answer as to what I think their intentions are. They have repeated it, that the only morality they recognize is what will further their cause, meaning they reserve unto themselves the right to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat, in order to attain that, and that is moral.
When his administration came in, the Reagan people said, no, this is an evil empire. The only way you can deal with it is through strength.
Initially, the response of the Reagan administration was to be suspicious of arms control, to not have an interest in it.
And the argument was, we are inferior to the Soviets in nuclear weapons. We cannot negotiate from a position of inferiority.
Ronald Reagan led a neoconservative contingent into office in 1981. Like himself, many of his advisors were former members of the Committee on the Present Danger, and they continued to believe that the U.S. remained strategically vulnerable. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger moved quickly to establish a program of strategic modernization, adding $33 billion to Jimmy Carter's record defense budget.
Part of the Reagan campaign was to convince the Congress, who had to appropriate the money.
Soviet military power used colorful prose, and it used the worst possible case, indeed stretching some points about what the Soviet Union was doing. Nothing was underestimated.
I am announcing today a plan to revitalize our strategic forces and maintain America's ability to keep the peace well into the next century. First, I have directed the Secretary of Defense to revitalize our bomber forces by constructing and deploying some 100 B-1 bombers. Second, I have ordered the strengthening and expansion of our sea-based forces. Third, I've ordered completion of the MX missiles.
Ronald Reagan had made the MX missile the centerpiece of the largest military buildup in U.S. history. Meanwhile, massive anti-nuclear demonstrations were occurring throughout Western Europe in protest of NATO's plans to deploy new intermediate-range U.S. missiles.
Public protests in Europe had a tremendous effect in pushing the United States forward to pursue an INF agreement.
The United States is prepared to cancel its deployment of Pershing II and ground-launched missiles if the Soviets will dismantle their SS-20, SS-4, and SS-5 missiles. This would be an historic step.
The proposal, known as Zero Option, was praised in some quarters as bold and politically brilliant, but others saw it as disingenuous. The administration was asking the Soviets to dismantle hundreds of new weapons in return for a U.S. agreement not to deploy a missile force that had not yet been built.
The American and Russian ambassadors have decided that they'll meet alternately at each other's mission.
initially twice a week.
The INF talks began in late 1981, but made little progress.
Until the arms race ends, until we have real peace with real justice, we will not go home and be quiet. We will go home and organize.
By the spring of 1982, the nuclear freeze movement was spreading across the United States and culminated with a rally in New York Central Park that many would call the biggest protest in American history.
To understand what took place under Reagan, I think you have to understand that by that time there were very, very strong forces at work within the government. President Reagan hated nuclear weapons. President Reagan would like to have been the president that went down in history as getting rid of nuclear weapons. The Secretary of Defense hated any kind of concession to the Soviets. The Secretary of Defense thought we needed more nuclear weapons.
The Reagan administration, I think, was dissatisfied with the thought that the U.S. might not win a thermonuclear war.
There was certainly a rhetorical change in that Reagan and Secretary Weinberger talked about prevailing.
From the beginning, the hallmark of the Reagan administration was peace through strength. Even as calls for a nuclear freeze grew louder in the fall of 1981, Ronald Reagan directed changes in top-secret guidance for the use of nuclear weapons. National Security Decision Directive 13 stated that we must be prepared to wage war successfully, and that the United States and its allies must prevail.
NSDD 13 was not that different from PD 59, but we didn't want to be justifying the largest buildup in history based on Jimmy Carter's strategic policy.
There is not that much difference. It alters the priority of the targets. The other thing about NSDD 13 is that it had some unfortunate rhetoric. It had this very chest-thumping, if there's a nuclear war, we're going to prevail.
Even though these were very classified documents and nobody ever intended them to see the light of the day, there was nonetheless great attention paid to the rhetoric by which you expressed things, because it became the basis for how you talked about nuclear weapons in public discourse.
In the spring of 1982, the Reagan administration's increasingly harsh public rhetoric about the Soviet Union served to fuel public fears.
The image of Russian militarization and the Russian military and the possibility of war between the two sides, it just seemed like there was a kind of warmongering administration.
The march of freedom and democracy, which will leave Marxism, Leninism on the ash heap of history as it has left other tyrannies which stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people.
As Reagan was denouncing the Soviets, the Pentagon's defense guidance was leaked to the New York Times. The combination of harsh public rhetoric and secret guidance about the possibility of a protracted nuclear war, in which American nuclear forces must prevail, made for a combustible mixture.
We worked very hard to get declaratory policy down right. That was the era of the nuclear freeze, the nuclear protest, and we had to explain what we were doing to our own people. Nobody knew what prevailing meant. And when it finally became an issue in the context of the nuclear freeze, President Reagan began using a phrase that we worked out with Secretary Weinberger. A nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought.
While the Reagan administration softened the language of declaratory policy, a war of words and images continued between a president who sought to confront the Soviet Union.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
And those seeking to portray the fearsome result of that confrontation.
The danger was described in very vivid, very emotional terms, and even if significant portions of the human population survived the initial cataclysm of war, the long-term ecological effects would be absolutely devastating.
The nuclear winter thesis, as advanced by Sagan, was basically wrong. The effect was vastly overblown, and the model which they used was clearly wrong.
It wasn't so much that people thought that there wouldn't be a nuclear winter, but that he really overstated it pretty seriously.
So once you put in realistic assumptions about targeting and realistic assumptions about what the climate would do, you came up with a potential cooling of possibly a summer's duration, a few months, over certain parts of the world. Not a trivial effect, but nothing like what was originally described.
I think that the nuclear winter debate intensified the images that people had about what a nuclear war would do to the world and why a nuclear warfighting policy didn't make any sense.
Reagan was facing a problem. He did not trust that the Soviets would pursue a peaceful cause. He felt strongly he had to ensure the survival of the American people under favorable conditions.
Edward Teller had long advised Ronald Reagan on matters of defense and now urged the president to abandon mutual assured destruction for a doctrine of assured survival. In the fall of 1982, Teller pressed Reagan to mount a breakthrough effort for a nuclear strategic defense. Reagan was receptive to Teller as well as to other proponents of non-nuclear defenses at the High Frontier Group. Reagan was searching for a way to challenge the Soviets that did not rely upon offensive weapons or arms control.
And technology was a very good way of challenging them because this was our strong suit. All of this came together, and Reagan, without very many people knowing, he announced what became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative.
I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
Well, the origin of SDI was President Reagan's antipathy to nuclear weapons. And he wanted a defense, a non-nuclear defense against nuclear weapons, which somehow he argued would render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
Shield, laser-based technologies, exciting new technologies that can render us safe from any possible nuclear attack. And he painted a very compelling image of the power of American technological know-how.
The supporters of the SDI in the technical community, and there weren't actually that many of them, but they believed, and rightly, that technology had changed substantially and that it was worth taking another look. Maybe we could build brighter lasers, higher intensity lasers, maybe X-ray lasers pumped with nuclear weapons and so forth.
That was fine on paper. There was not ever, to my knowledge, a laser system that could be deployed that made any sense whatever. Lasers in space would have been extraordinarily expensive and extraordinarily vulnerable and not assured of performance.
We really never had a defense. We had a policy to build a system, but that was only to do the research and development, $25 billion within the first 5 years, $50 billion, $75 billion over a period of 10 years, and then we would decide whether to go ahead with the construction.
So suddenly, almost overnight, people aren't debating nuclear arms control or nuclear freeze proposals. They're debating the technological effectiveness of the Strategic Defense Initiative.
And I think for a brief while, there was some significant hope among the population at large. But I believe that that was pretty quickly put to rest by the sort of traditional arms control community argument that was made right away and repeatedly, and I think very effectively, that there simply wasn't any way to have a comprehensive defense.
We had some nice technology from SDI, but no way you could have the leak-tight system.
The initial euphoria over SDI subsided in the months following the president's speech. Reagan's initiative would evolve into an extensive research and development effort, and the theme of U.S. technological superiority would clearly resonate with the Soviets. Reagan believed he had offered a way out, a technological solution to the nearly 40-year-old dilemma surrounding nuclear weapons. In May 1983, a pastoral letter by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops reframed this dilemma in moral terms, casting doubt upon the very premise of nuclear deterrence, not as an end in itself, but as a step on the way toward a progressive disarmament. But events in late 1983 would push the goal of arms control virtually out of reach. The September shoot-down of a Korean passenger jet by Soviet defenses was followed in November by the delivery of intermediate-range nuclear missiles to NATO, prompting the Soviets to withdraw from arms control negotiations altogether.
U.S.-Soviet relations were probably at that moment at the lowest point in many years. It was a true nadir.
This is San Francisco. We have lost our New York signal. Radar sources confirm the explosion of nuclear devices there in New York and up and down the East Coast.
We interrupt this program at the request of the White House.
At the end of 1983, the threat played out on television in dramatizations that, for many, crystallized the fear of sudden and catastrophic nuclear war.
They're on their way to Russia.
The nuclear danger was encapsulated with the image of global thermonuclear war. All of this popular culture material feeds into shaping a public mood that in turn creates the framework within which the strategists and the diplomats and the political leaders must operate.
And it was within this complex framework of emotional, moral, and international security issues that the president now found himself. It was a very uncertain time.